guys, Shelby here and welcome back. In the last video, we went over a few selectors and how we can start targeting things in your HTML with CSS by using what are called IDs and classes. Let's do a quick recap of that. And I wanted to show you some examples of what I added to my site of working examples of some class and ID attributes. In my HTML, I added a few things in here. On line 19, you can see I no longer just have an empty div tag, but rather I put that attribute of ID and added a value of header. And inside of there, I have a heading with the class of styled heading. And remember, IDs can only be used once on an element per page, whereas classes can be reused. So say I wanted to use this same class on this H2 down here, that is totally fine. I can use as many styled heading classes as I want to, because this is a great way to really help that concept of dry, which we talked about earlier, which is don't repeat yourself. If you wanted to add the same styles to this H1 as this H2, that would mean that you would write two rules before. But with the class attribute, adding this styled heading to both of them only means you have to write one CSS rule that will be applied to both of them. But for this case, I'm just going to have it on this H1 inside of this div with the ID of header. I also added a few more classes in here for where my sidebar content will go, as well as this div where my main content is. Just another good concept of knowing that classes and IDs can be applied to any HTML element on your page. And with those styles, I went in and wrote a few CSS rules. This first rule on line 52, you can tell is a little bit different than the rule that is below it on line 56. They both have different characters at the beginning of the selector. This top rule is targeting any element that has an attribute of the ID of header and giving it a different background color. Whereas this rule on line 56 is applied to any element on your page with the class of styled heading. So this goes back to the example of having that class of styled heading on that H1 and H2. That means that both of those would have this declaration of this color applied to them. And you only had to write one CSS rule for that. So this is a really good concept in keeping your code minimal and really effective. And you can see here, this is what my site looks like now when I've added that CSS that targets those IDs and classes. I have a dark green background for my header and a nice big white heading for my title of my website. So let's take a little break from adding more CSS rules and really kind of talk about positioning and writing your rules and giving you the tools to help debug your CSS as you start writing these rules. This first concept is what's called a position selector. So this isn't necessarily a new CSS rule, but rather a way that you can write the selector in your CSS. You can notice here in this first example that this doesn't really look like any other selector you've written before because all of our selectors so far have had no spaces in them. These kind of rules state that they want to select all elements within that first selector. So in this example, it is saying it wants to select any HTML with the tag of EM or emphasis, like Chris went over, inside of your paragraph tags. So if there was an EM HTML element inside of a heading, this rule would not apply because in terms of this position selector, it is looking for anything inside of a paragraph tag. And that space is what is really determining that this is a position selector rather than a normal selector that we've been working with so far. So to show an example of the HTML of what this would target, in this example, you can see this emphasis tag inside of this paragraph. And this CSS means that any EM tag inside of a paragraph like this would change its text color to yellow. So just to recap, position selectors are more specific and are a way for you to target specific HTML elements inside of other nested ones. So they look for elements inside, not ones that are in line with or above, but the ones that are inside of the parent targeted HTML element. So we separate these nested elements with a space, and that is very important to remember that the space is what makes this a position selector rather than a normal selector or a list of selectors. So another example, we have a position selector here with 4 levels of HTML. So a way to read this selector basically says, I want to find a strong tag inside of an A tag or a link element that is in a list item of an unordered list. So starting from right to left always helps with the specificity of what you're going to be targeting. And this is saying that I want to make all of these strong tags inside of this link the color purple. And down here is just an example of what that HTML would be for that selector. So you have your link that has the href of a program's HTML file and this strong tag in here. So really the only thing that is going to be the color purple is the word program. It won't be our program. It will just be this word that is wrapped in this strong selector. If you got rid of this strong tag inside of this position selector and it just was the UL, LI, and the A, that would mean target every link inside of the list item inside of the UL. So that would mean that all the text in this link would be purple and the words our program would be purple. But in this instance, because we have this strong tag, it will only be the word program. Another concept with your CSS is the concept of cascading. So styles cascade down until they are changed. This means that these rules are also read from top to bottom, and this can get pretty confusing when you start adding a lot of classes and IDs. If you don't know why something is styled the way it is, it's probably because things are cascaded down and they are not really giving you the results you want because you may have put some CSS in the top of your file that is getting read before the rule that you actually want to apply to your code. So in this example, we have 3 rules that are targeting a P tag or a paragraph tag, an element with the class of red, and any element with the ID of special. This paragraph tag rule has 2 declarations applied to it of a color and font family, and then the selector for the class of red only has a color declaration, whereas this rule for the ID of special only targets the font family. So with these 3 P tags, I'm going to read out pretty much what these are going to look like, and then I'm going to put these in my HTML so you can see how this is working in real time. This first rule is stating that every paragraph should be the color blue with the font family Helvetica. So by default, all of these would be those 2 values. Because the selector for the class of red is the color red, that is stating that this second one will actually be the color red with the font family of Helvetica. And this last item really switches it up and has the font family Arial applied to it rather than Helvetica because it has that ID of special. So this might not make a lot of sense, so let's copy these 3 lines and pop over to our HTML file so we can see how this is working. So down here I have my 3 paragraph tags. There are no styles applied to them except for my global font family, so they all look pretty much the same. However, once I start adding these styles, the concept of cascading really comes into play. So now you can see all my paragraph tags have been changed a little bit. All of my paragraph tags are now blue, but these last 2 are red. And I think this third example really doesn't give a good font to show the difference between Helvetica and Arial. So we are going to change that value for font family for anything with the ID of special to be that impact font that we were using earlier. So now you can see each 3 of my paragraphs look completely different because even though these are all paragraph tags, the last 2 have different classes and IDs applied to them. And those are then targeted in the CSS to give them different CSS styles. I'm going to get rid of these, but that was just an example I wanted to show you on the concept of cascading styles and how that plays into your CSS file. Another concept is cascading priority. Your browser assigns priority based on the specificity of your selection that you are targeting in your CSS. The more specific the selector, the higher the priority. So this is basically when overrides come into play. You can see here that this rule has 3 classes applied to the selector as well as an HTML element, whereas this bottom one only has 1 class and an HTML element. This is saying that the styles that are applied to the more specific selector is going to have priority over any other selector. So in this instance, anything that is a paragraph inside of an element with the class clearance that is inside of the class sale that is also inside of anything with the class main will have the color red. And because that is the most specific selector, that style is going to have the highest priority. Aside from the specificity of your selector, say you have multiple rules in your CSS that target the same selector. This is when the tiebreaker becomes the position of that rule. Rules lower in a CSS file overwrite the rules that are higher in the file. So if you went into your CSS and originally had a rule stating that you want all of your links to have the background color yellow, and then you forgot that you had that rule and later on you realized you wanted to change them to be black again, and then you added this rule later on in the file, this rule would then override your first initial rule and change the background color from yellow to be black. This is a very common mistake I find that a lot of developers do when they're writing CSS and when they have multiple rules for the same selector and they can't figure out why things aren't styled the way that they really want them to in terms of their CSS rules. So if you're finding that things are looking kind of wonky or aren't styled the way that you thought they would be sure to look in your CSS file and make sure all of your cascading properties and your specificity is set correctly in your selectors. Another selector that I find is super helpful is the concept of using comma-separated selectors. So different from your nested selectors, comma-separated selectors are selectors that allow you to specify a set of styles to multiple selectors at once. So you can see in this example, it is a little different than the nested selector because this paragraph tag that is nested under an element with the ID of content has the comma after it, which states that that selector, as well as this selector of a paragraph tag inside of an element with the class of container inside of the footer, is getting those styles applied to it as well. So this is overall saying that both of these selectors will get the color blue as well as a background of dark gray hex value. You can have as many comma-separated value selectors as you want, and it's important just to remember that each CSS element is separated by a space and a comma, and not just a space. So a good example of this that I will be fixing in my CSS that you may see is in your CSS is all of my headings. My H1 styles are similar to all of my other heading styles, and this just looks clunky and a little bit repetitive. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit and make this all into one rule with a comma-separated selector. By adding all of my headings onto one line with those commas, this is stating that I want every H1, H2, H3, and so on in this list to have this hex color code applied to the text as well as this font family. Now if I refresh, nothing changes in terms of my styles because I'm not adding any styles. This is more just a way for me to organize my code. And note that the H1 still does have its own separate rule here on line 11 because I want the font size to be 105 pixels only for my H1 tags. Alright, so let's take a break here and clean up your code to get some comma-separated selectors into your CSS. If you find that you have some rules in here that are getting kind of repetitive, take a minute and start organizing them to put them in lists like I have on line number 6 for my headings. As usual, Chris and I will be here if you have any questions. Good luck.